Real pleasure to be here, particularly for the Centre of Work-Based Learning, because it seems to me that it's such a declaration of intent, and it's ambitious, it's determined, it's there's resource going into it, and it means something. And there's also other countries in which I work with who are asking themselves exactly the same questions at the moment. And I think a lot of the answers are difficult. A lot of the answers are located within a particular national context, and we have to evolve out of where we've come from. And so having a centre here which does this work, and alongside the work of Skills Development Scotland, which now funds 17 PhDs working in this field, well, that's brilliant. That really is. And that's sort of investment we need to see. And I think, so well done for that. And it's a real honour to be here. Well, absolutely, I kind of do work at the OECD. I don't run the OECD, wish I did, but don't. I head up the VET team, and I've done that for the last 6 months or so. We generally sort of like focus on VET systems, vocational education systems. And I just run past this rather quickly because there might be things of interest. What we do at the OECD is there are 36 different member countries, and we work with them to try and work out what's universal, what's particular. We collect data from all the different countries, and then we're able to work out, how countries compare to each other. That leads to analysis of more effective systems. It's about making public policy better, making it work better, more efficiently, more effectively, more equitably for people. And we do that by comparison, by understanding what's happened, what practice is like in those different countries. And so we've worked and published some various landmark reports. And at the moment, we're working on work-based learning, which I know is very relevant to what's happening in Scotland at the moment, because work-based learning is so important in any skills system, and it's often really neglected within skills systems. Often we kind of just hope that through some sort of osmosis process, we'll put somebody in a workplace and things will turn out all right. And it seems to us that it's really important at the moment to try and understand what we do in skills policy and put that in context, and to understand how national systems can optimize the good things and tackle, the opportunities, which they're presented with. And in particular, I kind of thought maybe some of this work we published quite recently on productivity, on the links between apprenticeship and productivity. And it kind of delves into the way that countries and employers can make decisions, and the decisions link to either having productivity boosts quicker or more slowly. And I think there's some interesting work there, which may be of relevance to people. But just behind these chairs, you can see like a little website there. Go and have a look, see what you think. But what I'm going to talk to you about is not that body of work, but it's a couple of it's kind of a very relevant piece of work which was undertaken a couple of years ago, 2016. Going to publish particularly in these two key reports, Skills Matter, which came out, let's say, in 2016, and the OECD Employment Outlook. And what these do is they cover a great deal of ground related to our understanding of adult skills. Now, across many OECD countries, we run a kind of an assessment. We work with national partners to ensure that to get young people and old people between the ages of 16 and 65, people of working age, and we ask them a whole bunch of questions, thousands and thousands of them, and we ask questions. We get some tests. We test their skills levels. We ask them about what they do. We ask them about do they use those skills at work. We ask them all sorts of different things about their pay, their background, their educational circumstances, and it's called the Survey of Adult Skills, or PIAC. And this data is really, really helpful. It tells us loads of different things. And so, it's probably one of the single best data sets which allows us to compare the skills levels between countries and to look for the connections between the level of skills and how well those countries do and how well individuals do within those countries. And you'll see here, this is just, I've put some of our tables up, and this is where I start edging across here behind the chairs. And you'll see, you probably won't be able to read the name of the. Can you read the name of the? You can't. Can you? Oh, okay, that's not so bad. If you can read, where these countries are, and what we've got here is we've got a scale here, which is about, our average proficiency. So we do a numeracy test within this. We do numeracy, we do literacy, we do tests around using problem solving and technology. Can you find something using the web? sometimes really quite simple things, more complex things. And here you've got the kind of the numeracy ones. And what we have is, the way that countries vary in terms of numeracy. This is the scale across here. We give them a scale of up to 500. There's 300 here, which is really good. And then, so this is on average, so 200 there. Countries vary a lot about where they stand. And you're all looking for Scotland, aren't you? Scotland didn't do this. Scotland opted out. There's going to be another round, though, in 2020, 2022. So opt in, England did it, Northern Ireland did it this time round, but many more countries, I'm sure, will do it next time round because people found it really helpful. And, so across this side is, the average. So, so like Japan scores really, really highly. Chile scores pretty lowly, but also the variability within countries. And so we kind of find that more equal societies sometimes have low levels of variability, and others have higher. Variability is important because it's about how your train of people are able to what sort of problems have people of low skills, how many people are low skills in a society. Sometimes you have lots of high skills, lots of low skills, averages in the middle, but it hides some big problems. England's got a big problem with low skills, really big problem with low skills. And so in terms of measuring skills, we kind of measure skills in terms of, we set people actually tests, a bit like an exam. And interviewers would go in and they'd make sure that they do them properly. But also we ask a whole series of questions about, do you actually use your skills at work or in everyday life? And this is important because what I want to talk to you about is something about, it's not just proficiency, how well you are in your literacy or your numeracy, but it's actually how often you use these skills. Because the skills can atrophy. It's if you don't use them, they kind of tend to disappear. And I know this very well because I moved to France about 6 months ago, and 20 years ago I lived in France the first time round, and the day I left I felt fluent. 1 year I lived in France and I felt fluent on that day, and I've never felt fluent since, and I'm working really hard to try and get back to that point. But your skills will decline over time. So use of them is really important. And we test proficiency, so how well you do in your exam, but how often you use these skills in your working life. And these are the sorts of things which are pretty everyday. And what's important in here, we kind of have a little, we kind of measure frequency a lot. Do it on a weekly basis, do it on a daily basis, do it on a monthly basis, do you hardly ever do it? This is of interest to us because what we find is that we have some good evidence that skills usage, both skills proficiency and skills usage, relates to high levels of productivity within a country. And here we have a little graph which kind of like shows the kind of the relationships which we're seeing. And these are kind of correlations. Here we kind of worked out output in terms of GDP divided by hours worked. Yeah? And so what you can see is this is about use of reading skills at work. And if you look at the average for countries, how often do you read, do you use these skills at work? The more people say they use them, the better the countries do. And that's kind of like a starting point for thinking, well, there's something really interesting here happening in terms of the relationship between our use of skills at work and economic well-being. And this is kind of important because there is because as well as the kind of the economic advantage, and I'll go through that in a second, there's a real personal advantage. High levels of skills are associated with great level of trust within communities, great levels of health for individuals. People with higher level of skills feel that they have more political impact in their societies, which is important for the conversations we heard this morning about kind of alienation within societies. We also know that high levels of skill correlates to greater levels of volunteering, at greater levels of civic society, a great sense of well-being. But we're kind of, we're not ignoring that. We're kind of putting that a little bit to one side because what we're really interested in, what I'm going to talk to the remainder of this presentation about, is about the economic advantage. And what you have here is a chart which kind of shows three things. Firstly, kind of relationship between level of education and wages. And here we have sort of like what the economists call a standard deviation, so like a kind of a meaningful extra section of a statistical analysis in terms of about 3 years more of education. And we see that people who have in the bars here, they earn higher wages. They earn more at work. Well, that's not altogether surprising. But then here we have, kind of the darker dots. This is kind of like your proficiency in literacy. So how well you do on your tests, And the interesting thing is that the higher indicator, rather than simply just proficiency, is actually, do you read at work? How regularly do you use these skills in the workplace? And what we find is that the people who use these skills in the workplace are earning more. And it's not just having the skill, it's using the skill. That's the thing which is really important in all of this. And this brings us to kind of the title of what I'm talking about here, which is the question of the extent to which employers, and many of you are employers in this room, so listen up now, as employers are able to structure work to optimize the chance of this sort of skill development happening. And there is a literature which is all around kind of high performance work practices. And what the literature will argue is that we can see that there are certain, if we structure work in a way where individuals have greater degree of autonomy over what they do, greater degree of decision making over the order in which they do things, where it's encouraged and enabled for them to work within teams and share information, that when we see workplaces like that and work practices like that, we find evidence of kind of higher levels of productivity. And this is something which is tested in this big study with all these big numbers of hundreds of thousands of kind of adults from across the world. And so we're looking at sort of like things within work organisations, those sorts of work practices, but also kind of management practices as well. So there's a literature as well thinks about does bonus pay really incentivise people to take to increase productivity? What about participation in training? Does it really work? We've all done courses where we felt didn't really get much out of that. But is anything meaningful happening? And what we can do is we can use this data across all these different countries, these universal experiences, to try and test whether we see relationships taking place. And this is important to us because, well, this is a bit of a menu. Here are a list of things which we can think, well, maybe we can integrate better ways of, more common ways of having this sort of working practice in our workplaces. And if we look at some of the examples here, so this is for statisticians amongst you. This is kind of correlations. So this is looking at the one set of data and seeing how it sets out against another set of data and seeing, without any kind of controls or regressions in place to take account of background and so on. But what we find is pretty consistently, what we've got here is, across this scale here is at 1, 2, 3, 4. This is, do you do things, maybe occasionally, once a month, less than once a month, weekly, 5 would be daily. So that's the kind of scale here, and thinking about how often you'd use your skills at work. And then we have these different, we kind of relate that to, kind of the high performance work practices, which we're describing. And so what you can see here is that, let's take this one over here. What we can see here is that people who say that to some extent, they're able to, kind of control the sequence of tasks which they have to do, are more likely to, do kind of problem solving, ICT, numeracy at work. We see that more frequently. So we find this interesting correlation between the two, and we see this across the board. Across it's a very similar pattern. You'll see, working across different ways. That we kind of see that those people who are experiencing high performance work practices are actually, demonstrating, those skills at work more often. And it's interesting here. This is on the terms of the management practices. Here, the scale is slightly different. For this scale, what we're doing is we're kind of taking one set of people who, who do say that they had here, kind of flexible working hours or training or bonuses, and we're taking that away from the average of people who didn't do that, and we're seeing what the difference is. And so we're finding it's like nearly it's up to 1 point on this scale, same scale. Are you with me? Everybody still with me? Great. Everybody's nodding. Not everybody. Most people are. Many people are nodding. Many people. And it's interesting here, it's the training, which is the biggest peak. We kind of see training particularly coming up quite strongly. Now, I've kind of taken a bit of time to kind of work through this because there's a point which we need to kind of struggle with, and I think this is going to be a question we need to ask ourselves. And I think this is going to be the focus of the panel session, which is why these chairs are all here, which we're going to have in a minute, about thinking which way does it run? Is it that your employer's high performance work practices opens up and enables you to use these skills in totally new ways? Is that the thing? Is that kind of the cause and effect? Or is it that work which demands use of these skills, reading every day, writing every day, is of the nature that it tends to be organised using high performance work practices? And we'll see there's certainly something of that going on. If we look at kind of the share of kind of high performance work practices by countries, we see quite a lot of variation. And if you think about kind of the economies in Scandinavia, as opposed to the economies in Greece or Turkey, we kind of see, we kind of think of, well, there are sort of different type of economies which we're thinking about. Greater use of technology, flatter workplaces. And if we look at, kind of the variation by, occupation, well, perhaps as expected, we see high-performance workplaces much more commonly with managers and professionals, with consultants. I imagine many of the people in this room get to choose what order they do things in. Is that right? Yeah. Many of you are nodding, Not today, you have to sit through the presentations, but, normally. And we kind of see, there's, people work in the postal service, and so I used to be a postie, did it for quite a while. And, you don't have a lot of choice about which street you do next, and so on within that. And so we kind of think, well, does this actually mean anything? And I think what the, what the analysis says is that we think it probably does mean something. And we think we do need to do more research and understanding how the relationship, how work is structured, can optimize skill usage. And skill usage, remember, is a good thing. It's a good thing. It's a good thing for the individual. It's a good thing for the employer. It's a good thing for society. We want more of that. And thinking about economies where we're going to see sort of technology change the nature of work, at the OECD we think that we will see a whole series of jobs disappear, but more commonly we'll see jobs change. And we'll see jobs change in new ways, and sometimes very radical ways. And some of the ways they can change perhaps might optimize skill usage within work. Others might work against it, but it's probably more likely that it's going to be in favor of greater use of skills within work, as people have to move from a maybe more simple technical task to being somebody who has to interpret information, work with people in order to be able to be personally effective in making things happen, because the technology will do more of the task in the future. And this is, I'm getting towards the end now, but this is some analysis we've done. This is a regression where you kind of take account of the background characteristics of everybody, and you try and make sure it's a fair sort of comparison. And if you look at kind of the people who report high performance work practices within their work, well, we see there are certain things like firm size is important. Bigger, it's more common in bigger firms, and actually it's very common in startups. Smaller firms not so common in. The nature of your occupation, as we saw, comes across here. The industry you work in, we kind of your levels of proficiency, and what I'm showing you here is that how these different things relate to your ability to use your skills at work, or whether you use those skills or not. And so we kind of see this kind of the nature. This is the white one. The nature of the way that work is organised makes a difference. And I think what we need to argue and debate and do more research on is how that relationship works between the two, which is the cause and which is the effect. We think it flows both ways. How can we optimize it and flow more in the way of any job being able to be sort of transformed into we'll be able to have more of these high performance work practices. So this is what they are, again, just to remind ourselves. And I think within this, we should just pause to think, well, what does this tell us about education and how we do education? For some of us who've kind of worked in education for a while will think, well, there is something here which is about fundamentally overhauling how education is done, about the student-less-centered learning, but there's also something here about what we used to see as enterprise learning, where you set young people projects, you give them the space to work it out for themselves, you make them sort of like work in their teams, you make them apply their learning in new circumstances, you ensure they're personally effective in doing that. I think that's something which is very meaningful for us in thinking about how workplaces actually relate to classrooms. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to join the panel. We'll have opportunity to discuss maybe some of these ideas and other ideas which have come up through the day. Thank you.